Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of I Got Nothing, a podcast for exhausted writers. I am your exhausted writer, Leani Lopez. Welcome new people, welcome back returning people. As usual, I just want to give a shout out to all of you who keep coming back and listening. I am continually amazed every time I look at my stats and see how many people have been listening. It kind of blows my mind. If you guys have questions for me or you have topics you would like me to cover, please feel free to message me or email me. I have a website. You can find me on all social media. I will have the link in the description like I always do. And even if you just want to say hi, I am always ready to chat. And to the people who have been rating the podcast, thank you so much. Every time I see a rating or a review, it makes me really happy. So this episode, I wanted to be a little bit specific. Sometimes I go broad with my topics, but this one in particular, I remember being asked about in sort of an offhand way, and I wanted to dive deeper into the topic. So inevitably, when you are writing, at some point, you are going to have to write dialogue. People talk. It's what we do. It's what I'm doing right now. It's most of the time our main source of communication is speaking to one another. And writing dialogue can be the most frustrating thing in the world if you let it. The main reason why I wanted to cover this topic is because it was such a struggle for me when I was really starting to take my writing seriously. I have been writing since I always say since I was 10, but most likely younger than that. Well over 20 years now. And I don't ever remember paying attention to dialogue. You know, when you're a kid, you just kind of write whatever's in your head. And when you're a teenager, you still write whatever is in your head, but it's through a different lens. And most of the time, you don't really think about how people talk to each other. At least I didn't until I got much older. And I told this story before, but I will tell it again for new people. I studied creative writing in college, and one of the best classes I took was a creative writing workshop. It was about 10 or 11 people. We could write whatever we wanted to. We just had to bring in a copy for the other students, and we would meet in our class. We would exchange papers. We would leave. And then we would come back with notes, and we would just give everybody notes on their writing. And it was rinse and repeat, and it was amazing. Definitely scary, not gonna lie, definitely terrifying. But I learned so much, I think, in that one class than I did in like the majority of my college career. But one of the things that had come up was I was having dialogue between two sisters. And almost every person in the class said they were having trouble following who was speaking. Now, when you're writing dialogue, there's a format to it. Usually, if you have two people speaking, you establish who's speaking first, usually by saying, you know, so-and-so said, told, whatever. Then you establish who's speaking next. And then when you continue on the scene, you don't have to say who's who. The reader automatically knows it's like, okay, this person spoke, so now this person is speaking, and you kind of have that back and forth. So format-wise, it's pretty specific how you handle dialogue. But it's also equally important to focus on what they're saying and how they are saying it. So when I got that note that they said it was hard to tell which sister was which, it was eye-opening for me because one sister is way gentler than the other sister. So it should have been reflected in the language that they were using, like what specifically they were saying, the words they used, but it wasn't. I hadn't done that yet. So I took a look at that scene and I realized that I literally was just writing them the same way. And no wonder nobody could tell who was who, because I didn't have them with their personalities. I didn't stop to think, okay, well, this woman is a mother, so she is going to refer to a baby as she. This woman is not a mother, does not want the child in the house. She's going to refer to it as it. Like, those types of little things and tweaks that I just had never thought of before. And it made me so acutely aware of how people speak and what they say and the words they use. Another part of that is that I have major anxiety. I have had anxiety since I was a kid. So I was already analyzing how people were speaking. I just didn't realize it yet. And I was already picking up on different people's word usage or cadences. And again, didn't even realize it. I used it for my own survival. Didn't stop to think I could also use it for my craft until I got much older. And then I was like, oh, that's what I was doing. Yeah, I can hopefully recreate that on the page. So writing dialogue is not just about, I need these two characters to talk to each other, so now I'm going to make them talk to each other. You have to keep in mind the characterization. First of all, would these people talk to each other? You may want them to talk to each other, but if it doesn't make sense for them to talk to each other, it doesn't matter how good the dialogue is. It's going to feel off because it's not something that should be happening. Or you can use that and be like, I need these people to talk. They don't want to talk to each other. So I'm going to make it apparent that they don't want to talk to each other. And it's going to give that scene just, at least for me, that's like my favorite. When I read dialogue and I'm like, oh, these people hate each other. This is so cool. I want to see how this works. But it's also not to get psychological or psychoanalyze. It's also the study of people. We are the product of our environment, and how we grew and learned to speak is dependent on how the people around us were speaking. So certain people are gonna, for example, use swear words. Some people are gonna use milder swears, and some people aren't gonna swear at all. A big thing that I didn't realize affected my language until I got older is that I was raised by parents who were bilingual and whose first language had been Spanish because my grandparents spoke Spanish. So there were certain words I learned, or certain phrases I would say, that in school people would give me funny looks for, or my husband would be like, did you just say that? Like, so for example, instead of, blowing out the candle, I would say turn off the candle. Or instead of, give my son a bath, I'd say I'd take him a bath, little things like that. Or I remember specifically in high school referring to a hair tie as a barrette, because that was just kind of one word. Like, I knew the colloquial Spanish word for it, and it was roughly translated to barrette. And this girl was like, it's a hair tie. And I was like, okay, whatever. But little things like that. So if your character is bilingual or raised by, parents who are bilingual, then their language is probably going to be a little bit different. They're going to use phrases a little bit differently. Another thing to consider is, what's the setting? Is this a formal setting or is it an informal setting? So if it's a formal setting, you're going to have different language than if it's just two friends sitting, having a beer and talking. If somebody is having dialogue with their boss or a potential client, they're going to be a little bit more formal than if they're having, pizza and ice cream with their best friend. So that is another thing you have to keep in mind when you're writing dialogue. I think one of the things that really struck me over the years as I've done this over and over and over again is to balance the realism with the necessity. And that kind of ties back to what I was saying before. You need these characters to talk to each other, or you need a character to say a certain thing, but you still have to keep all of those other points in mind. See, again, I've said this before and I'll say it again, and I'll probably say it in the future. People who say writing is easy don't know what the hell they're talking about. This is a lot you have to keep in mind when writing a simple conversation with people. And sometimes that conversation or dialogue is going to flow and it's going to be great. And other times you're going to be like, this is not working. So when you have a character that you're like, crap, I need them to say this or I need them to bring this thing up, you still have to do it in a way that feels organic and not just like, I'm the author and they need to say this so I can write the next line kind of thing, it's going to happen. It happens all the time. But it's still important to keep those other points in the back of your head. Oh, another thing that, speaking of keeping things in your head and things that are tricky, be very careful with writing accents. Accents are tricky. People speak differently than what you're used to. And to you, someone may have an accent, and this character will inevitably have to speak. So a lot of the times you can get away with a description or line about them speaking with a heavily insert accent here. And that's all well and good. That usually works. However, a lot of the times that might affect what they are going to say. So you have to be very careful. I would suggest researching, pulling up YouTube and listening to people with those accents and how they speak, and maybe not focus so much on the words themselves, but how they deliver the words, because culturally people speak a different way. Some people speak a lot with their hands. Some people are very animated. Some people aren't. So that might be a way to get your point across that this person has an accent or is from somewhere else. Avoid stereotypical accents. You know the ones that I'm talking about. It's the ones that they do in movies when they hire non-people of color for roles that are people of color. Don't do that. Don't be that person. Don't just write the accent on how you think it should be. Tying back to my other episode I did about research, do your research. We are in an age where we have smartphones and computers and tablets and all that jazz. It's very easy to search for a video or a movie or something and pull that up and just listen. Maybe even watch movies from that country in that native language to see how they say things and how they speak in that language. So even if you're not writing dialogue in that language, you're still going to get the cadence down. You're still going to get the way they express themselves without necessarily tweaking words to make it sound like it has an accent. I think that's kind of where people get caught. You want to kind of spell it all out, but then you also have to realize that that's going to be pretty difficult for some people to read. Perfect example, classic movie that I loved that I hadn't read the book until I was much older was The Secret Garden. And as I was reading the book, there's a point where she starts talking in a certain accent, and it was just so hard for me to read and follow and understand what she was saying. And it was important for the story, I guess, or it was at least a point to show that she was being comfortable there and kind of blending in. But it was difficult to read, and I still don't remember half the stuff that she said. I had to go back and reread it a couple times. So be careful when you're writing accents. They're tricky. Just avoid stereotypes, please. That, in general, when you're writing a character with a different cultural background or a different ethnicity, please avoid stereotypes for the love of God. Just avoid them as much as possible. But a major piece of advice I will give you, which I have only just started doing myself in recent years, is when in doubt, read the dialogue out loud. A lot of times it sounds good in your head, and you'll write it and you're like, yeah, that's awesome. And then you read it later and you're like, I just said that 6 times in 2 lines. Which I've done so many times. I just ended 4 sentences with her. But you don't catch it because in your head you're like, yeah, okay, that looks fine. But when you say it out loud, you're like, people don't talk like that. I don't talk like that. Case in point, when I was first writing To Court Death, it was written as a screenplay. And I did a lot of work on it before I actually sat down and read it. And so I asked my husband, hey, do you mind if we just take a night? You have one script, I have one script, and you and I just run the movie together. And he was like, hell yeah. And I cannot tell you how many times we were like, that doesn't sound right. On page, it was fine. And in my head, I read it, but then I would try and say it, and it just didn't feel comfortable in my mouth. And I'm like, oh, that's probably not how someone would actually say that line. And he had the same problem. And we went through and sort of marked off those points. And I went through and changed it later. But even when I decided to do it as a podcast and I, cut it up into 5 parts and I had my cast and we did our read through, there were still times where I'm like, oh, I missed a word there. It should say this. Or I added a word because I changed the line and forgot to edit properly. Or there would be times where they would say a line the way they thought it was, but when they read it later, they're like, oh, I said that line wrong. And I ended up falling to a groove with them and saying, that's okay. As long as it gets the point across, if it feels easier to say it slightly different, I am not a stickler for that. I like to be very collaborative with my actors. At least I did when I was doing To Court Death. And there was times where we changed whole lines, where I would have them read the line 2 or 3 times, and I'm sitting there and they're like, you don't like that line, do you? And I'm like, I don't, and I don't know how to fix it. And they would give suggestions. Or there was one time where I was with my friend Maddie and she read a line and I was like, I don't like this. She was like, okay. And I was like, I need like 2 minutes. Just like in the recording, it's just silence as I rewrite the line. And then when she said it again and we kind of tweaked it, it just flowed better and it made more sense. And I was like, okay, that was bothering me. So I'm a huge advocate for saying the lines out loud, reading the dialogue out loud. And if you don't have someone to do that with or don't want to do that yourself, a lot of programs have dictation and reading features. And that's really good at helping you catch those moments where you forgot a word, which I do all the time. I write too fast sometimes and just forget a word. And it's not even writing fast. I've been doing a lot of speech to text because of my carpal tunnel, and I still do it. I'll read through and I'm like, I totally didn't say a word there, or speech to text didn't catch it. But usually I didn't say it. But you can have the program read your story out loud to you, and it'll help with flow. Not just the dialogue, it'll help with your writing as a whole, but in particular, hearing the dialogue back and forth helps in the editing process and in the writing process. The final tip I will give for writing dialogue, for the love of God, please break up large monologues. You don't have to stop the talking to insert a descriptor or anything if you don't want to. I mean, formatting wise, please break up the monologues. There's a way to do that format wise. You have the open quotes, you have them talking, then you insert a new paragraph, continue the monologue with an open quote again, and then keep going. And then when you're done, that's when you close the quote. So there is a way to format a monologue that is not just a huge chunk of text, because a lot of people, that's difficult on their eyes. And when you're faced with this giant text, I know I'm like, oh boy, okay, we gotta get through this. Just break it up visually because it's gonna help your reader read it properly. Yeah, I think that's all I got on writing dialogue. It's a lot of stuff to keep in mind. Again, this is stuff that I've learned over the past 20 plus years writing various genres, mostly fiction, but it's also something that people may not even realize is a thing, might not even think about. I certainly didn't until it was pointed out to me. So go forth, write your dialogue. Please beware of stereotypes. Be careful with accents. And just have fun. My go-to tip is always going to be add more banter. I love banter. I love reading it. I love writing it. Literally ask anybody who's read any of my stuff, my original or fan fiction stuff. It is banter galore. My ghostwriting client was like, I love when you write banter. Please write more banter. And I was like, yes, I can do this. I have the power to do this. This is what I've been waiting for. Alrighty, so that has been I Got Nothing, a podcast for exhausted writers. Again, I'm your exhausted writer, Leani Lopez. Thank you for joining me. You can find me on my website. You can find me on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, all that jazz. I will have the link to my stuff in the description. So check it out. If you have a topic you'd like me to cover or a question you'd like me to answer, let me know. And I look forward to talking to you guys again soon. Bye.